You think you can intimidate me? I don't think I know. Your days are numbered.
Boss, we got a problem! Ah!
You will learn your lessons soon.
How dare you! You will pay for this!
The silence in the grand study was heavier than the slap had been. Han Suk-jin stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the ice in his glass rattling against the crystal as his hand trembled. A physical betrayal he hadn't allowed since childhood. Below, the gravel driveway was empty, the Rolls-Royce gone, the guests dispersed in a cloud of hushed whispers and scandal. But the sting on his left cheek remained, throbbing in time with a heartbeat that felt foreign in his own chest. He set the glass down on his mahogany desk and stared at the framed map of Seoul's redevelopment districts. To the world, those lines represented his empire. To him, in this moment, they looked like the skeletal remains of the city he had helped devour. Closing his eyes was a mistake. The darkness behind his lids immediately bloomed into a violent, flickering orange. 1994. The smell of expensive sandalwood in his office was replaced by the acrid, choking stench of melting plastic and treated lumber. He could hear it again, the roar of the warehouse fire that had turned his world into an oven. He was 10 years old, tucked into a crawlspace behind a stack of shipping crates, his lungs screaming for air that wasn't there. He remembered the heat most of all. It wasn't just a temperature. It was a weight that pressed down on his chest, promising to turn his bones to ash. In the memory, a figure appeared through the wall of black smoke. It wasn't a god or a ghost, but a man in a heavy, soot-stained yellow jacket. Suk-jin remembered the sound of the man's labored breathing through a respirator, the rhythmic hiss-thump of a hero defying the inferno. Then the man had reached out. A beam had shifted, a tongue of fire licking across the man's forearm as he shielded the boy's small body. Suk-jin had seen the skin bubble and blacken in real time, yet the hand hadn't flinched. It had gripped his waist with a strength that felt like life itself. "I've got you, kid. Don't let go," the voice had rasped. Suk-jin opened his eyes, gasping as if he were still breathing in that 1994 soot. He looked down at his own hands, clean, manicured, and stained with the metaphorical blood of 1,000 ruthless business deals. He had spent 30 years building a fortress so high that he thought he'd never have to look down at the charred remains of his past. He had convinced himself that he was a self-made man of steel, forgetting that the steel had been forged in a fire someone else had pulled him out of. Dong Chul's words rang in his ears like a funeral bell. "I didn't pull you out of that fire so you could burn this city down." The king of Seoul slumped into his leather chair, the shadows of the room lengthening around him. He realized then that the slap hadn't been an assault. It had been the first honest thing anyone had given him in decades. It was a mirror, and for the first time, Suk-jin was forced to look at the monster staring back. The heavy oak door of the study creaked open, admitting Min-ho, Suk-jin's head of security. The younger man's face was flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and suppressed violence. He adjusted his suit jacket, his knuckles still white from the tension of the afternoon. "Boss, we found him," Min-ho reported, his voice low and jagged. "He lives in a tenement in the Gyeoryong district. The boys are already there. They're waiting for your word to teach him the proper way to address the dragon." Suk-jin didn't move. He remained staring out at the city lights, the phantom heat of the 1994 fire still prickling his skin. "Wait," Suk-jin commanded, the words slicing through the room like a blade. Min-ho blinked, confused. "Boss? He humiliated you in front of the elders. If we don't make an example of him, the other families will see it as—" "I said wait," Suk-jin repeated, finally turning. His eyes were cold, but behind the mask, there was a frantic, desperate hunger for the truth. "Get the car. Only you and I are going. If a single hand is laid on that man before I arrive, I'll ensure whoever did it never uses their hands again." The drive to Gyeoryong was a descent into a world Suk-jin had spent a lifetime trying to erase. The gleaming skyscrapers of Gangnam gave way to cracked asphalt, tangled power lines, and the suffocating scent of coal briquettes and stagnant water. They pulled up to a crumbling concrete block that looked like it was held together by nothing but rust and stubbornness. Inside the narrow hallway of the third floor, two of Sukjin's enforcers were looming over a battered wooden door, their shadows stretching menacingly across the peeling wallpaper. As Sukjin approached, they stepped aside, eager to witness the retribution. Instead, Sukjin pushed past them and entered the room. The apartment was a single, cramped space that smelled of menthol and old paper. There was no furniture of value, only a thin sleeping mat and a small table cluttered with orange pill bottles. In the corner, Kim Dong-chul sat in a threadbare chair, his chest heaving. He wasn't wearing the work jacket now. In his simple undershirt, his frame looked skeletal, his ribs tracing sharp lines against his skin. A violent, wet cough suddenly racked the old man's body. He doubled over, clutching a handkerchief to his mouth that came away spotted with blood. He reached for an oxygen tank tucked beside the chair. His hands, the same hands that had once been strong enough to carry a child through a collapsing building, now shaking violently. Sukjin stood frozen. The man who had been a titan of justice in his memories was being hollowed out by poverty and illness. He looked at the medical charts pinned to the wall: chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Stage 4. Get out! Dong-chul rasped, eyes watering as he fought for air. He looked at the expensive silk of Sukjin's suit with pure, unadulterated disgust. Your money can't buy back the lungs I lost in that warehouse, boy. And it certainly can't buy my forgiveness. Sukjin looked at his guards, who were waiting for the signal to strike. He felt a wave of nausea. He realized that while he had been building palaces, the man who had given him the chance to live was dying in the dark, breathing the very air that had saved Sukjin's life. The following morning, the administrative offices of the Seoul Central Hospital were thrown into a quiet frenzy. A mysterious trust, listed only as the 1994 Foundation, had wired a sum that not only cleared the outstanding debts of a retired firefighter named Kim Dong-chul, but established an open-ended credit line for the highest tier of private respiratory care. There was no name attached, no press release, and no request for a thank you note. It was the first time in Sukjin's life he had spent money without expecting a seat at a table or a favor in return. While Dong-chul was being transported to the hospital's VIP wing in an ambulance he hadn't called, a fleet of unmarked black vans descended upon the Gyeoryong district. The men who stepped out weren't carrying the brass knuckles or silenced pistols of the Jung Syndicate. They were carrying industrial air purifiers, rolls of premium insulation, and tool belts. Under Minho's confused but strict supervision, they worked with the clinical silence of a pit crew. They replaced the rotting window frames that let in the city's yellow dust, scrubbed the mold that had been colonizing the walls for a decade, and installed a state-of-the-art ventilation system that hummed with the sound of a clean future. Sukjin watched the progress from the back seat of his car, parked 3 blocks away where the shadows were longest. He watched his enforcers, men trained to break bones, awkwardly assembling a hospital-grade adjustable bed and stocking a small refrigerator with high-protein meals and fresh produce. He felt a strange, uncomfortable tightening in his chest. It wasn't the searing heat of the fire this time, but a slow, cold ache. He was realizing that all the protection he had sold over the years was a lie. He had been a merchant of fear, while this old man had been a merchant of life. By sunset, the tenement room was transformed into a sanctuary of sterile air and soft light. Sukjin stepped into the room one last time before the old man was due to return. He placed a small, vintage brass fire bell on the bedside table, a relic he had recovered from a private auction years ago, never knowing why he felt compelled to own it until now. He didn't leave a card. He didn't leave his name. He simply stood in the center of the clean, quiet room and took a deep breath, feeling the lack of dust in his own lungs. For the first time in 30 years, the King of Seoul felt like he was finally paying interest on a debt that could never be fully settled. As he walked out, he adjusted his cuffs, the dragon on his ring catching the light. Looking less like a symbol of power and more like a mark of shame he was determined to burn away. The transition from the hospital's sterile VIP wing back to the renovated tenement was a journey Dong Chul took with narrowed, suspicious eyes. He moved through his apartment, his hand trailing over the new, airtight window seals and the high-tech air purifier that whispered in the corner. He looked at the vintage brass fire bell on his bedside table, a piece of history that should have been in a museum or a wealthy collector's vault. The realization didn't come with a smile. It came with a cold, hard knot of recognition in his gut. When the black sedan pulled up to the curb 2 days later, Dong Chul was waiting on the sidewalk, leaning heavily on a cane but standing with his head held high. Sukjin stepped out of the vehicle, his presence a jarring contrast of silk and steel against the gray concrete of the district. He expected a nod of gratitude, perhaps even a softening of the old man's gaze. Instead, he met a wall of ice. "Take it back," Dong Chul rasped, his voice stronger thanks to the medication, but trembling with fury. He held out a thick envelope containing the deed to the apartment and the medical receipts. "I didn't spend 30 years breathing through a scarred throat just to become a kept man for a gangster." Sukjin paused, the wind ruffling his hair. "It's not a gift, Dong Chul. It's a debt. You're dying because you saved me. This is the least I can do." "The least? You think money fixes the hole you're digging for the city?" Dong Chul took a staggering step forward, poking the silver head of his cane towards Sukjin's expensive chest. "You spend your mornings ruining families with high-interest loans, and your nights laundering blood through construction contracts. Then you come here and buy me a fancy bed to sleep in? That's not a debt paid. That's a bribe for your own conscience." Sukjin felt the air leave his lungs as if he'd been struck again. "I am trying to help you. If you want to help me, stop being the man I had to save." Dong Chul hissed, a fresh coughing fit momentarily doubling him over. He waved off Sukjin's instinctively reaching hand. "Don't touch me. If you want to honor the boy I pulled out of that fire, then earn the life I gave you. Tear down the syndicate. Stop the protection rackets. Be the man who builds things instead of the one who watches them burn for profit. Until then, your money is just ash to me." Dong Chul turned his back, retreating into the building with a slow, painful dignity that made Sukjin's empire feel like a house of cards. Standing alone on the cracked pavement, the King of Seoul looked down at the envelope in his hand. The weight of his wealth had never felt so heavy, and for the first time, he realized that his redemption wouldn't be bought with a checkbook. It would require a total surrender of the only world he knew. The following morning, Sukjin did something he hadn't done in decades. He walked through the city without an armed escort. He traded his usual silk tie for a dark charcoal turtleneck, hoping to blend into the gray morning mist of the old district. His destination was the Bukbu fire station, the very place Dong Chul had called home for 30 years. As he turned the corner onto the narrow street, the sight of the station hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was a crumbling relic of a forgotten era. The red paint on the massive bay doors was flaking away like sunburnt skin, and a thick chain held one of them shut. A single, aging pumper truck sat in the driveway, looking as tired and wheezy as Dong Chul himself. But it wasn't just the building that was dying. It was the neighborhood surrounding it. Sukjin stood on the cracked sidewalk and looked at the storefronts he technically protected. A small grocery store across the street had its windows boarded up, scrawled with the jagged marking of the Jung Syndicate. A dragon coiled around a dagger. It was the mark of his own protection racket. A tax on the poor that bought them nothing but the privilege of not being burned down by his own men. He watched as a young man in a leather jacket, one of his own street-level runners, leaned against the fire station's brick wall, casually flicking a cigarette but toward the entrance. The firefighters inside, Men with soot-stained faces and hollow eyes walked past the thug with their heads down, terrified to look a criminal in the eye on their own doorstep. Suk-jin felt a sickening realization settle in his gut. He had spent years telling himself that the mafia brought order to the chaos, but looking at the boarded-up windows and the defeated posture of the neighborhood's heroes, he saw the truth. He wasn't the protector. He was the parasite. Every brick he had added to his luxury villa had been pulled from the foundations of places like this. He walked up to the station's memorial plaque, a tarnished bronze plate listing the names of those injured in the line of duty. At the bottom, nearly obscured by grime, was Kim Dong-chul, 1994. A firefighter stepped out to wash the driveway, stopping short when he saw the expensive polish of Suk-jin's shoes. The man didn't see a benefactor. He saw a predator. He gripped the hose tighter, his knuckles whitening, a silent plea for the monster to move on lurking in his eyes. Suk-jin didn't say a word. He couldn't. He simply turned and walked away, the weight of the dragon ring on his finger feeling like a brand of fire. He realized now that he hadn't just neglected the man who saved him. He had spent 30 years systematically destroying the world that man had fought to protect. The stillness of the district was shattered not by a slap, but by the screech of tires against wet pavement. Suk-jin's sudden absence from the boardroom and his frequent disappearances into the slums had not gone unnoticed. In the predatory ecosystem of the Jung Syndicate, distraction was seen as blood in the water, and Lieutenant Kong, a man with a jagged scar across his throat and a soul built on ambition, had decided it was time to test the king's resolve. Kong stood on the sidewalk outside Dong-chul's tenement, his black leather gloves creaking as he tightened his fists. He didn't see a hero or a savior when he looked at the building. He saw a weakness, a sentimental anchor dragging Suk-jin toward the bottom. He signaled to 3 of his men, who moved toward the entrance with the practiced, predatory grace of wolves. "The boss has forgotten what happens to those who don't pay their due," Kong whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "We're going to remind him. Start with the old man. If he can survive a fire, let's see how he handles a blade." Inside, Dong-chul was reaching for his oxygen mask when the door to his sanctuary was kicked off its hinges. The sterile air Suk-jin had paid so dearly to provide was instantly fouled by the scent of cheap cigarettes and malice. Dong-chul didn't scream. He simply gripped the brass fire bell on his nightstand, his knuckles white, his icy blue eyes narrowing with a familiar, ancient courage. "I've faced monsters bigger than you in rooms hotter than this," Dong-chul rasped, even as the first enforcer grabbed him by the collar of his undershirt. The assault was brutal and efficient. They didn't just strike him. They methodically began to dismantle the life Suk-jin had tried to build for him. They smashed the air purifier, shattered the new windows, and tossed the high-protein meals across the floor. It was a message written in wreckage. Just as Kong stepped into the room to deliver the final blow, a shadow fell across the doorway that made even the air seem to turn to ice. Suk-jin stood there, his tailored suit jacket discarded, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. He wasn't the king in this moment. He was the dragon unleashed. The fury in his eyes was so absolute that one of the enforcers instinctively took a step back, dropping the lead pipe he was holding. "Kong," Suk-jin said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You made a mistake. You thought he was my weakness." He stepped over the threshold, his gaze never leaving the blood on Dong-chul's lip. "He is the only reason I haven't killed you all yet." The room exploded into motion, but for the first time, Suk-jin wasn't fighting for territory or profit. He was fighting for the man who had taught him how to breathe. The fight was over in a matter of seconds, but the silence that followed felt like an eternity. Suk-jin stood over the crumpled forms of Kang's enforcers, his breathing steady but his knuckles split and bleeding. Lieutenant Kong scrambled backward against the shattered remnants of the air purifier, his hand clawing for the pistol tucked into his waistband. Before he could draw, Suk-jin's boot was on his wrist, pinning it to the floor with the weight of a death sentence. "Give me one reason," Sukjin hissed, his voice vibrating with a primal rage that seemed to darken the very air of the room. He reached into his waistband and pulled his own weapon. A sleek, cold piece of hardware that had ended many lives in the name of the Jung Syndicate. He pressed the barrel against Kang's forehead. Kang let out a desperate, wheezing laugh. "Do it, boss. Kill me. Prove that the old man is wrong. Prove that you're still the monster we all follow. If you don't, you're dead anyway. The council won't accept a saint for a king." Sukjin's finger tightened on the trigger. The logic was flawless in the world he had built. In the Mafia, mercy was a confession of weakness, and weakness was a terminal illness. To kill Kang was to restore order. To kill Kang was to protect his throne. It was the easy choice, the path he had walked for 30 years. "Sukjin." The voice was faint, barely a rasp through the wheeze of damaged lungs. Sukjin looked over his shoulder. Dongchul was propped up against the bed frame, his face bruised and his lips split, but his icy blue eyes were steady. He wasn't looking at the gun. He was looking at Sukjin's soul. "Don't do it for me," Dongchul whispered, a thin trail of blood tracing the line of his jaw. "If you kill him, the fire wins. You'll just be another thing that burns." Sukjin looked back at Kang, whose eyes were wide with the expectation of the end. Then he looked at his own reflection in the polished slide of the gun. He saw the King of Soul, a man of silk and blood. But behind that image, he saw the 10-year-old boy in the crawlspace, watching a man sacrifice his skin to keep the darkness at bay. With a slow, deliberate motion, Sukjin engaged the safety and holstered the weapon. The tension in the room snapped like a bowed string. "Min-ho!" Sukjin shouted toward the door. His head of security appeared, looking stunned at the restraint his boss was showing. "Call the authorities. Not our friends on the payroll. Call the Internal Affairs Division. Give them the coordinates of Kang's heroin warehouse in Incheon and the ledgers for the Bukbu protection racket. All of it." Kang's face went pale. "You're committing suicide, Sukjin. You're handing them the keys to your own cell." "No," Sukjin said, walking over to Dongchul and gently helping the old man back onto the bed. He didn't look back at his fallen lieutenant. "I'm finally walking out of the building." He sat beside the man who had saved him, ignoring the blood on his white shirt. For the first time, the dragon was gone, replaced by a man who was willing to let his empire burn if it meant he could finally breathe clean air. The news of the dragon's surrender traveled through the veins of Seoul faster than a fever. By the time the moon rose over the city, the air in the high-altitude boardroom of the Jung Syndicate was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and betrayal. The council, a circle of 12 men who moved the city's tides from the shadows, did not raise their voices. They didn't need to. The silence was the sound of a guillotine being sharpened. "He has handed the ledgers to the authorities," a white-haired man at the head of the table whispered, his voice like dry parchment. "He hasn't just abandoned his throne. He has set the palace on fire while we are all still inside." The vote was unanimous. There was no room for sentiment in a ledger of blood. The order was issued. Han Sukjin was no longer a brother, a boss, or a king. He was a liability to be liquidated. Across the city, the lights of Sukjin's Mediterranean villa flickered and died. The private security team, men he had paid millions to ensure his safety, vanished into the night like mist, taking their loyalty and their weapons with them. They knew better than to stand in the way of the council's wrath. Sukjin stood in the center of his darkened foyer, the silence of the house feeling heavier than any threat. The luxury that had once been his armor now felt like a target. The marble floors and crystal chandeliers were no longer symbols of power. They were the cold walls of a tomb. A heavy thud echoed from the front gates. Then another. The perimeter had been breached. Sukjin didn't reach for his gun. Instead, He felt for the small brass fire bell he had tucked into his pocket. He realized with a strange, soaring clarity that he didn't want to die in this house of stolen things. He didn't want his story to end in a place built on the tears of the neighborhood he had visited just days before. "Minho, go," Sukjin said into his burner phone, his voice steady. "They're coming for the head, not the hands. Take whatever is left in the safe and get out of the city." "Boss, I can't leave you," Minho's voice crackled, thick with a rare emotion. "You aren't leaving a boss," Sukjin replied, looking at the shadow of a black van sweeping across the driveway. "You're leaving a ghost." He slipped out through the service entrance just as the first flashbang detonated in the grand hall, shattering the stained glass he had imported from Italy. The villa was being reclaimed by the darkness that had birthed it. As he disappeared into the woods bordering the estate, Sukjin looked back one last time. The fire was coming, just as Dong Chul had predicted. But this time, Sukjin wasn't the boy hiding in the crawlspace. He was the man walking toward the only light that mattered, the flickering neon sign of the old fire station. The sirens of the Bukbu fire station screamed through the night, a jagged sound that tore through the heavy silence of the district. Sukjin, standing in the shadows of an alleyway near the fire station, saw the orange glow on the horizon before he heard the news. The syndicate hadn't just come for his life. They had decided to erase his work. The new community center, the skeleton of a building Sukjin had been funding to replace the neighborhood's decay, was a tower of flame. As the aging pumper truck roared past him, Sukjin saw a familiar white-haired figure through the passenger window. Dong Chul was there, a retired man who had no business being on a fire line. Yet his icy blue eyes were fixed on the inferno with a grim, ancestral duty. By the time Sukjin reached the site, the heat was a physical wall, thick with the scent of burning pine and chemical accelerants. The syndicate's parting gift was a message written in fire. The firefighters were struggling. The hydrant pressure was low, a result of the decades of infrastructure neglect Sukjin had once ignored. Suddenly, a cry went up. A group of local teenagers who had been using the unfinished center as a sanctuary were trapped on the third floor. The stairwell collapsed behind them. Sukjin didn't think about the council's hit squads or the warrants for his arrest. He saw the black smoke billowing from the third-story windows and felt the phantom weight of the 1994 warehouse fire pressing against his lungs. He saw Dong Chul grabbing a heavy coat, his body racked by a coughing fit that nearly brought him to his knees. "Stay back, old man," Sukjin shouted, emerging from the dark. He didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed a wet wool blanket from the back of the truck and draped it over his shoulders. "Sukjin, don't," Dong Chul rasped, reaching out with his scarred hand. "The structure is gone. It's too late. It's 30 years late," Sukjin replied, his voice calm over the roar of the blaze. He ran into the mouth of the furnace. The interior was a kaleidoscope of falling embers and searing blackness. It was 1994 all over again, but the roles had shifted. He found the kids huddled in a corner of the framing, their faces masked by their shirts, their eyes wide with the same terror he had felt as a boy. One by one, he guided them toward the emergency ladder, shielding their small bodies with his own as the ceiling groaned and buckled. The heat bubbled the skin on his forearms. The pain was a searing, purifying reality. As the last child reached the safety of the ladder, a support beam gave way. Sukjin threw himself forward, the weight of the debris pinning his leg, the smoke finally beginning to win. He lay there in the dark, breathing in the ash of his former life. But through the roar of the fire, he heard a rhythmic hiss thump. He looked up to see a figure in a soot-stained jacket through the haze. It wasn't the dragon who was being saved, but the man he had finally become. The sirens of the night had long since faded, replaced by the sterile, rhythmic ticking of a clock in a government interrogation room. Sukjin sat across from federal prosecutors, his hands bandaged and his lungs still tight from the smoke of the community center. He didn't ask for a lawyer. Instead, he pushed forward a stack of ledgers and a decrypted hard drive, the map of the Jung Syndicate's nervous system. By sunrise, the King of Seoul was no more. The dragon had dismantled his own hoard, trading his silk suits for a numbered jumpsuit and his villa for a concrete cell. The years that followed were a slow, quiet penance. Behind the high walls of the correctional facility, Suk-jin found a strange peace he had never known in his Mediterranean palace. He worked in the prison's maintenance shop, his hands growing calloused as he repaired engines and fixed leaks. He spent his evenings reading books on urban development and fire safety, replacing his greed with a hunger for a different kind of legacy. He refused all visitors from his former life, cutting the final threads of the syndicate until the name Han Suk-jin became a ghost story whispered in the dark corners of Gangnam. On the day of his release, the air was crisp and smelled of early spring. Suk-jin stepped through the heavy steel gates, carrying nothing but a small bag of personal items and the brass fire bell he had managed to keep through the transition. He wore a simple denim jacket and worn boots, his hair graying at the temples. He looked like any other man on the street, a citizen, anonymous and free. He stopped at the curb, expecting to find an empty sidewalk or perhaps a bus stop. Instead, a battered, familiar pumper truck sat idling by the gate. Leaning against the red fender was Kim Dong-chul. The old man looked frilier now, his oxygen tube a permanent fixture, but his icy blue eyes were as sharp and clear as a winter morning. Suk-jin walked toward him, his heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He stopped a few feet away, the silence between them filled with 30 years of shared smoke and hard-won redemption. He reached into his bag and pulled out the brass bell, placing it in Dong-chul's scarred hand. "I'm out of the building, Dong-chul," Suk-jin said, his voice thick with emotion. The old man looked at the bell, then up at the man he had saved twice, once from the fire and once from himself. A slow, tired smile creased his weathered face. He reached out and gripped Suk-jin's shoulder with a strength that defied his illness. "I know, son," Dong-chul rasped. "The air is clean today. Let's go home." As the old truck pulled away from the prison walls, Suk-jin looked out at the city he had once tried to own. He realized then that he didn't need a crown to be a king. He only needed a seat at a humble table and a chance to build something that wouldn't burn. The legacy of the slap that echoed through Seoul did not end with the closing of a prison gate or the rebuilding of a community center. It lingered in the quiet, transformative moments that followed, serving as a profound meditation on the debt of grace and the true nature of power. For Han Suk-jin, the journey from a throne of steel to a seat at a wooden kitchen table was a testament to the fact that redemption is not a destination, but a relentless, daily choice to be worthy of the air one breathes. The first great lesson of this story is that status is never synonymous with stature. In the beginning, Suk-jin possessed everything the world defines as power, wealth, fear, and influence. Yet he was spiritually hollow, a man of automatic vigilance, who had forgotten how to look a neighbor in the eye. It was Dong-chul, a man with scarred lungs and a crumbling apartment, who possessed the only authority that mattered. His hand didn't strike out of malice, but out of a father's desperate love, proving that one man standing on the foundation of truth is more powerful than an empire built on a lie. Furthermore, the narrative highlights the heavy responsibility of survival. We are rarely the sole architects of our own lives. We are built upon the sacrifices of those who stood in the fire so we wouldn't have to. Suk-jin's realization that his very breath was a gift from a man he had spent decades indirectly destroying is a call to accountability for us all. It reminds the audience that we owe it to our saviors, be they parents, mentors, or heroes, to live a life that honors their sacrifice rather than squandering it on greed. Ultimately, the story illustrates that the most difficult fortress to dismantle is the one we build around our own hearts. Suk-jin had to let his world burn to find his soul. He learned that protection isn't about high walls and armed guards. It's about the courage to be vulnerable and the willingness to sacrifice a legacy of blood for a future of peace. As Suk-jin and Dong-chul sat together in the evening light of the fire station, watching the neighborhood children play in the shadow of a new, safe community center, the message became clear. No one is ever too far gone to choose the light. The ultimate value of a life is not measured by what we take, but by what we are willing to give up to ensure that the next generation never has to hide in the crawlspace. In the end, it wasn't the dragon that survived the fire, it was the man, finally breathing clean air, finally home.